This module will focus on unconscious bias. You may already be saying, who, me? I don't have unconscious bias. But how would you know if you have it or not? Unconscious bias is hidden in attitudes and stereotypes that we don't even know that we have. The learning objectives for this module are to recognize the difference between unconscious bias and explicit bias, to examine unconscious bias with real life situations, and to reflect on ways to overcome unconscious bias. Do you ever find yourself having reactions that you may not be proud of or don't understand where they came from? Like laughing at an offensive joke or thinking that overweight persons have no business eating that type of food, or being uncomfortable when you see a same-sex couple showing public affection. These are examples of unconscious bias. Some people are openly racist, sexist, classist, or homophobic. They deeply believe through experience, cultural beliefs, and family norms that there is something wrong with people who are different from them. We have many names for this, but for our purposes, we will refer to this as explicit bias, meaning it is done on purpose. Unconscious bias, which can also be referred to as implicit bias, are the ideas, attitudes, and stereotypes that a person unconsciously associates with another person or group of people. These ideas and stereotypes have an impact on how that person understands and works with those other people and groups. The next video we watch will be a discussion between my daughter and myself on how we have experienced unconscious bias from others and how we displayed unconscious bias ourselves. Hi, everyone. I just thought it might be a nice opportunity in the module to hear a real conversation about experiences with unconscious bias. So this is my daughter, Nicole White, and we're going to just have a conversation about experiences that both of us have had. One that we've learned from, and for me, even a situation where I was the person acting with an unconscious bias. But Nick, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about, an experience that you had?
Yeah, so I went to a predominantly white institution for grad school, which was a culture shock for me because growing up in Atlanta, I was around successful Black women and men. Going to a predominantly Black institution, I was again surrounded by people who looked like me, and then going into grad school was a different environment. And I came upon someone who had never actually interacted with a person of color or a Black woman, to be exact, outside of the media. And he made mention, we were doing a project together, and he made mention to me that because I was a Black woman, I didn't know anything about science. However, I have a whole chemistry degree. And he also mentioned that Black women in STEM were not essential, and that we weren't needed, and other people would be able to do our work better. And my question to him was, why do you think that? Like, instead of getting an attitude or acting out a character, which is what he wanted me to do, he asked me, I asked him, what made you think that? And he said, well, I've never worked with a Black woman before. And so out of ignorance, he made mention to that. Another situation at the same institution where a white guy said that I threatened him, or he said that because he was sitting in my seat, he said, I'm going to get up so that you don't get an attitude with me or try and beat me up. I had never given him any kind of evidence that I would do such things, but because I'm a Black woman from Atlanta, I get labeled as aggressive or
angry
black woman. Exactly. So those are just two examples that come to top of mind where I was stereotyped, and I'm nothing like that. So yeah.
So I had an experience, maybe a little bit opposite to that. As you know, I travel a lot, and I was on a study abroad program with 14 students from my school. And most of the students were African-American female, but we had 2 Asian students and we had 1 white student. And he was an older white male student. And we were on this trip for about 2 weeks. And it was the last day, and we were sitting at the airport, and we were talking about health promotion initiatives that happen in barbershops as a way to encourage more Black men to get health exams and things along those lines. So very popular way, particularly now, for people to try and get Black men into care. And so the white student, as I think I said, is an older white male student, and I looked at him and I said, hey, you know, does that happen in white barbershops? You know, is that the way it happens in white barbershops? And he just kind of looked at me. And I knew the minute he looked at me that I had said something wrong. But his comment to me was, I don't know, Dr. White. I get my hair cut in the Dominican barbershop. And I was like, oh, okay. And I felt like I should have said something to him then because I knew it had offended him. But I just apologized and let it go. A week later, he came into my office and he said, Dr. White, can I talk to you? And I just knew I was going to get it for making that comment. And that wasn't what he wanted to talk about. He wanted to share with me an experience that had happened while we were on the trip. And while he was talking in a group conversation with all of the other students, they were talking about Black fraternities and sororities and hazing. And he made a comment in that group, and he was like, I think that hazing is terrible. We have enough going on in our community without people, you know, purposely trying to hurt each other in a hazing example. And the other Black students looked at him and they said, our community, you don't get to say we, our community. You're not a part of our community. And he explained to me how hurt he was. He said, you know, Dr. White, I don't think you know my story. I don't think anybody knows my story. You know, as I said, my grandparents had a housekeeper and she was Black, and I actually met her granddaughter. And as it was, I married her granddaughter.
Wow.
So I married her granddaughter. I graduated from school. And the whole time I was in school, it was always that my friends were more Black than I had white friends. After I got married, I went in the service. We lived overseas for a while. We moved back to Atlanta. We lived in a Black community in Atlanta. I joined a Black church in Atlanta. I became a deacon in that church. And so for me, while I know that I was born white, my culture and the way that I interact has always been through the culture of a Black lens, because that's what's been most comfortable for me. That's what I learned, even the vernacular, and I learned the customs and ways to eat, and even in going to church. And so when they said to me, you know, you don't get to say we, you don't get to be a part of our community, it was very hurtful, because I do feel like I'm a part of that community. And the only reason that they would say I couldn't be a part of that community is because of the color of my skin.
Wow.
Not because they understand anything about who I am.
Wow.
And I tell this story even to my students as a way to help people to understand, don't make judgments about people based on what you see.
Yeah.
Take the time to get to know who a person is. Unconscious bias, it's something in some ways all of us have.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't mean we shouldn't go without checking it. It doesn't mean that, oh, I made a mistake, I didn't know. Even when I said the situation when I knew I had said something to offend him, I should have went back right away.
Yeah.
Besides just, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It should have been, hey, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have made an assumption like that.
Right.
Those are the ways we do more healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's okay, I'd like to add a little more to that. I was having this conversation with somebody else a couple days ago, and I was saying to them, you know, like you said, unconscious bias is very normal. It's not normal, but it's very common. And all human beings have that prejudgment about someone. But something that I've been challenging myself on is that when I realize I have one, go educate myself on what it is that I have an unconscious bias about, so that now it's not coming from a place of fear or a place of unknown. Now, if I have, you know, a bias about something, it's rooted in facts.
So how do you take a minute to realize, hey, that's the stereotype, or that's where does that come from?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
I think it has a lot to do. I have a really high EQ. I have really good emotional intelligence. I've been told that. And so I know that when I get that feeling or I see that particular group that I know I'm like, a little weary of, I check myself. And then again, it goes back to being self-aware and being authentic in myself. And I'm very much rooted in authenticity. And so I take the time to check myself and say, okay, why do I think that? And now that I know I have this unconscious bias, now it's on me to do something about it. And that's the thing that I think is important to get across to the audience is it's on you to do something about that unconscious bias. You can continue to have it and know that you have it and do nothing about it, or you can choose to educate yourself, and that's how we grow together to stop this plague of unconscious bias.
Wow, great. That's really great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
for
taking the time to talk
to me about it. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of it.
You're welcome. Unconscious bias can have very detrimental effects, but there are some practical steps that you can take to examine your own unconscious bias. In the supplemental material for this module, you will find more detailed information on the ways to overcome unconscious bias. But just quickly, I want to share that an implicit association test is an online test that takes about 10 minutes to complete and can help you check your level of implicit bias. The remaining 5 steps all involve your ability to be aware of your thoughts and your actions. Let's review what was presented in this module. In this module, we discussed explicit bias, meaning purposefully treating someone differently, and unconscious bias, the sneaky attitudes and stereotypes that we don't realize that we have. We also examined unconscious bias in a real situation by listening to a short exchange between myself and my daughter. Lesson learned: even people who focus on diversity and inclusion professionally have unconscious bias. And finally, while we did not spend much time on discussing ways to overcome unconscious bias, you will have the opportunity to reflect on ways to work on unconscious bias by reviewing the steps in slide 8 and completing the supplemental worksheet titled Overcoming Unconscious Bias. So in the very first video of the first module, I shared that this information was specifically for you. Yes, you. I do hope that the information has been helpful in defining key terms regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, providing real-life scenarios of experiences related to exclusion and unconscious bias, and sparking an interest in you as a servant leader who is committed to being as inclusive, as empathetic, and as caring as possible. Thank you for taking this journey with me.